Let's turn the world upside down. At first, that sounds like Roger simply wanted to overthrow the world government or start a new era. But what if Oda has been hiding the real meaning of that sentence for more than 25 years? Because the more you look at the world of One Piece itself, the stranger it becomes. Nothing about this planet works the way it should. The oceans make no sense, the islands make no sense, navigation makes no sense. And when you begin connecting Roger's words to Nami, to Kid, to the road poneglyphs, to the log pose, to the abyss, and even to the void century itself, an unbelievable possibility begins to appear. What if Roger wasn't talking about changing the world? What if he was talking about discovering the real one? Because today, we're going to dive into one of the craziest theories I've ever worked on. And by the end of this video, I think you'll never look at the map of One Piece the same way again. Before we even begin talking about Laugh Tale, we first need to ask ourselves one very simple question that almost every One Piece fan completely ignores. How do people actually navigate this world? Think about it. In our world, sailors have used compasses for centuries. But in One Piece, that doesn't work this way. The very first time the Straw Hats enter the Grand Line, we learn something absolutely insane. Normal compasses become completely useless. Instead, every single pirate, marine, explorer, and adventurer is forced to rely on something called the log pose. At first glance, that just seems like another fun fantasy mechanic Oda invented to make traveling more interesting. But if you stop for just a second, it's actually one of the weirdest pieces of world building in the entire series. Because the log pose does not point north. It doesn't point south. It doesn't point east. It doesn't point west. It points toward the magnetic field of the next island. Read that again. Every island in the Grand Line possesses its own unique magnetic signature. Not a mountain, not an entire continent, every single island. That isn't normal. That shouldn't even be possible, which immediately raises an even bigger question. Why? Why would Oda create an entire navigation system based around magnetism instead of using ordinary geography? Was it simply because it sounded cool? Or has he been quietly telling us from the very beginning that something happened to the planet itself? Now let's take this one step further. If every island has its own magnetic field, then someone has to ask the obvious question. What created them? Because natural magnetic fields exist, but an entire chain of islands, each acting almost like individual magnets connected together through invisible routes, that's different. Almost as if someone designed this system. Almost as if somebody wanted people to travel along very specific paths instead of freely exploring the ocean. Suddenly, the Grand Line stops looking like a natural sea and starts looking like a gigantic maze. A maze where every pirate is unknowingly following invisible magnetic rails that somebody else created hundreds of years ago. And if that's true, then maybe nobody has actually been sailing freely this entire time. Maybe everyone, including Roger, was following the same ancient system. Now here's where something else suddenly becomes interesting. If navigation is controlled through magnetism, then why did Oda choose Nami to become the navigator of the future Pirate King's crew? Think about every Straw Hat. Zoro dreams of becoming the strongest swordsman. Sanji wants the all blue. Robin wants the true history. Frankie built the Thousand Sunny. Usopp wants bravery. Everyone's dream directly connects to the final saga. So why would Nami's dream simply be drawing a map? That feels almost too ordinary. Unless her dream isn't simply drawing a map. Maybe she's trying to reconstruct the original world. Because nobody ever says Nami wants to draw a map. She wants to draw the complete map of the world. But what if that map doesn't exist anymore? Think about that for a second. The world government erased an entire century of history. The ancient kingdom disappeared. Entire civilizations vanished. Is it really impossible to imagine that the original map disappeared too? Maybe today's world isn't the original world at all. Maybe the Red Line, maybe the Calm Belts, maybe even the Grand Line itself didn't exist before the Void Century. If continents were moved, if oceans flooded, if islands shifted, then every map ever created before that event would instantly become useless. And suddenly, Nami's dream becomes one of the most important dreams in the entire story. Because if the world itself changed, someone eventually has to figure out what it looked like before. Now let's go back to Roger. He reached Laugh-Tale, learned the true history, and discovered something so unbelievable that his entire crew burst into laughter. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. Roger never told the world what he found. He had years to write it down, expose the world government, or leave detailed instructions, but he chose silence. Why? Maybe because the truth wasn't something you could simply tell people. Maybe it had to be seen. Maybe it had to be experienced. And maybe that's exactly why Roger smiled and said, "Let's turn the world upside down." Not because he wanted a revolution, but because once you understand the real shape of the world, everything you believed before literally turns upside down. But then I remembered one of the strangest conversations Oda ever wrote. Very early in One Piece, Shanks and Buggy start arguing. Not about treasure, not about pirates, and not about devil fruits, but about something incredibly specific. Which is colder, the North Pole or the South Pole? At first, it's just a funny gag. Everyone laughs and the story moves on. But this is Oda, and Oda almost never wastes dialogue, especially when it involves Roger's crew. So why dedicate precious manga panels to a conversation about the world's poles? What if that wasn't random at all? What if the poles themselves are one of the biggest clues to understanding the world's true geography? And what if Oda hid that clue all the way back in chapter 19, knowing nobody would realize its importance until the final saga? Even stranger, who leaves Roger's crew and sails toward the East Blue? Shanks. The same Shanks who later gives Luffy the straw hat. The same Shanks who somehow always seems to know more than everyone else. Could it really be coincidence that one of Roger's closest companions immediately begins guiding the next generation without ever revealing the truth? Or was Shanks waiting for someone capable of doing what Roger couldn't? Someone with the right crew, the right historian, the right navigator, and maybe the right person who could control magnetism itself. Now, this is where the theory stops being just about navigation and starts becoming something much bigger. Because over the last few chapters, Oda introduced a single word that immediately caught my attention: the abyss. At first, it almost feels like another mysterious location, just another strange name that will probably be explained later. But this is Oda we're talking about, and whenever he introduces a completely new concept this late into the story, it almost always connects to something we've already seen hundreds of chapters ago. So I started asking myself one question: what actually is the abyss? Is it simply a place underground? A giant cave? Some ancient prison? Or could it be something much more terrifying? Let's go back to one of the most shocking moments in the final saga, the destruction of Lulusia. When Imu uses what appears to be the Mother Flame's power, the island disappears in an instant. Most fans immediately said the island was vaporized. Makes sense, except there's one detail Oda deliberately refuses to let us ignore: the hole. That hole never disappears. Weeks later, months later, it is still there. And that's strange, because if enough energy was used to completely erase an island, the ocean should eventually fill the space. Water always seeks balance. That's how gravity works. So why does the hole remain? Why does Oda keep showing us an impossible wound in the ocean itself? Unless that hole isn't simply missing water. Maybe it's an opening. Think about Eni's lobby. Another impossible hole. Water falls forever. Nobody knows where it leads. Nobody even questions it anymore. It's simply accepted as one of those strange things in One Piece. But what if it was never supposed to be normal? What if Oda showed us the answer hundreds of chapters ago, long before we even knew the word abyss? Because suddenly we have two enormous holes in the world. One beneath Eni's lobby, one where Lulusia once stood, and neither behaves naturally. Coincidence? Maybe. But One Piece stopped believing in coincidences a very long time ago. Now think about another location, Wano. Deep beneath modern Wano lies another world, an ancient civilization, an entire country buried below the surface, not destroyed, not erased, still there, almost frozen in time. When Oda revealed Old Wano, he quietly proved something incredibly important. History in One Piece isn't always erased. Sometimes, it's simply hidden. And if one entire civilization can exist beneath another, who's to say that isn't true for the rest of the planet? Now let's take one more step. The name itself. Void Century. Have you ever wondered why Oda chose that name? Not the Lost Century, not the Forgotten Century, not the Hidden Century. He specifically who's void, a word that literally means emptiness, nothingness, a space where something should exist but doesn't, or at least doesn't appear to. What if the void isn't simply describing missing history? What if it's describing where that history is? Imagine this. 800 years ago, the ancient kingdom loses the Great War. The 20 kingdoms somehow reshape the planet itself. Not only do they erase books, not only do they erase names, they erase an entire world. Not by destroying it, but by separating it. Almost like folding reality in half, leaving one civilization above and another below. Suddenly, Roger's words become terrifying. Let's turn the world upside down. Because maybe Roger wasn't talking about overthrowing anyone. Maybe he literally discovered the other side. And then another thought hit me. Where does Imu actually spend most of his time? We see the empty throne. We see Pangaea Castle. We see the flower room. But somehow, Imu always feels detached. Almost as if we're only seeing a tiny fraction of where he truly exists. What if Marijois isn't his kingdom? What if it's only a doorway, a connection between two realities, a place where someone can rule the surface while remaining hidden somewhere much deeper, somewhere inside the abyss? Now, before anyone says that's impossible, let's remember something. One Piece already has pocket dimensions. Mirror World, Brulee's Mirrors, Caribou's Swamp, Blueno's Door Fruit, the Book World. Even Beige carries an entire fortress inside his own body. Oda has shown us again and again that space itself isn't limited by normal physics, so introducing another layer of reality wouldn't actually be new at all. It would simply be the biggest version of an idea he's been building for years. And suddenly, the road poneglyphs start looking different. What if they never pointed toward an island? What if they pointed toward a place that no longer exists on the surface? That would explain everything. Because if Laugh-Tale isn't hidden by distance, but by dimension, no eternal pose could ever reach it. No log pose could ever lock onto it. No ordinary map could ever find it. Only someone who understands the true shape of the world could ever arrive there. And now, let's connect this back to Nami. Imagine discovering that every map ever drawn has only represented half of reality. The oceans, the islands, the red line, everything, incomplete. Then Nami's dream suddenly becomes much larger than drawing a beautiful map. She wouldn't simply become the greatest navigator in history. She would become the first person in 800 years to draw the true world, both sides, the surface and whatever lies beneath. And if that happens, Roger's words suddenly stop sounding metaphorical. They become instructions, not destroy the world, but look at it differently. Because perhaps the greatest lie the world government ever told wasn't about the ancient kingdom. It wasn't about Joy Boy. It wasn't even about the Void Century. The biggest lie was convincing the entire world that this is the only world there is. But we're still missing one final piece. Because even if another world exists, how do you actually reach it? And that's where Oda's obsession with magnetism, the log pose, the road poneglyphs, and one pirate named Eustass Kid may suddenly become the most important pieces of the puzzle. Now, let's assume, just for a moment, that everything we've talked about so far is true. The world isn't exactly what we think it is. The Grand Line isn't simply a dangerous sea. The road poneglyphs aren't just treasure maps. And somewhere beyond the world everyone knows, there is another layer of reality, connected to the Void Century. Then one question suddenly becomes more important than every other mystery in One Piece. How do you get there? Because if another world exists, why hasn't anyone found it during the last 800 years? Millions of people have crossed the Grand Line. Thousands have reached the New World. Roger reached Laugh-Tale. Luffy is almost there. So what exactly separates everyone else from the truth? I think the answer has been in front of us since Chapter 1. Navigation. Oda has never treated navigation like background information. In almost every pirate story, the navigator is just the person steering the ship. But not in One Piece. Nami isn't just steering. She's constantly solving problems that nobody else even understands. She predicts impossible weather. She notices changes in ocean currents before they happen. She understands clouds that shouldn't exist. She survives seas that kill experienced pirates. She adapts faster than entire crews. And the story repeatedly reminds us, nobody else could have brought the Straw Hats this far. Without Nami, Luffy never reaches Alabasta, never reaches Skypiea, never reaches Water 7, never reaches Whole Cake Island, never reaches Egghead. The future Pirate King literally depends on his navigator, and I don't think that's accidental. I think Oda has been telling us all along, the final obstacle won't be defeated with haki, it will be solved with knowledge. Now let's talk about something almost nobody questions, the log pose. Everyone accepts that it follows magnetic fields, but have you ever asked yourself, why does it have to charge? Think about it. The log pose reaches an island. Then it has to spend hours synchronizing with that island's magnetic field. Why? If it were simply a compass, that wouldn't be necessary. Instead, it's almost behaving like a receiver, like it's downloading information, learning something, adjusting itself. Almost as if every island is broadcasting a signal. What if the Grand Line isn't showing you the original magnetic network, but a damaged one? A system that has survived 800 years, but no longer functions perfectly. That would explain why routes become unstable, why islands seem impossible to predict, why weather ignores physics, why pirates constantly get lost. The world itself may still be trying to recover. And then there's Eustass Kid. Because if the world truly runs on magnetism, then Kid isn't just another powerful pirate. He's literally carrying the one devil fruit capable of interacting with the world's navigation system itself. Not destroying ships, not throwing metal, changing magnetic order. Imagine for a second that Kid reaches Awakening's true potential. Not creating giant mechanical arms, not assigning magnetism to enemies. Imagine manipulating the magnetic poles of entire islands. Imagine forcing islands to reconnect. Imagine restoring ancient magnetic pathways that disappeared during the Void Century. Wouldn't that completely change navigation? Wouldn't it make impossible routes possible again? Now remember something Roger said after reaching Laugh Tale. He was too early. That sentence has confused fans for decades. Too early for what? Joy Boy? Nika? Poseidon? Maybe, but what if Roger also lacked something much simpler? The right people. Roger had Odin, he had incredible fighters, he had Kozuki knowledge, but he didn't have Robin. He couldn't read every poneglyph himself. He didn't have Nami, the greatest navigator the world would ever produce. And he definitely didn't have Eustass Kid. The one pirate whose devil fruit directly controls magnetism. What if Roger understood the truth, but simply couldn't access it? Imagine Laugh Tale isn't the end of the journey. Imagine it's the control room, the place where everything finally makes sense. Roger arrives, learns the truth, discovers that the world can actually be restored, and then realizes the people capable of doing it haven't even been born yet. Now suddenly, I wish I had lived in Joy Boy's time hits completely differently. Because Roger wasn't disappointed, he was relieved. He finally understood someone else would finish the journey. And who has Luffy gathered? Robin, Nami, Frankie, the Thousand Sunny, Jinbei. Every single member fills a role Roger's crew either lacked or couldn't fully complete. The Straw Hats aren't simply another pirate crew, they're the solution. Now let's go back to one of the first mysteries in the series, the Red Line. People often ask, why would anyone build a continent across the entire planet? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe nobody built it. Maybe someone moved it. Think about what we've seen recently. The Mother Flame possesses unimaginable energy. Ancient weapons can destroy islands. The sea level has already risen before. Massive geological changes clearly happened. So what if, 800 years ago, the entire world was rearranged? Continents shifted, magnetic poles changed, oceans flooded, and the Red Line became a scar. Not a natural continent, but the wound left behind when the world itself was forced into a new shape. If that's true, Roger's words become even more incredible. Let's turn the world upside down. Not because he wanted chaos, not because he wanted revenge, because the world was already upside down. The ancient kingdom lost. History was rewritten. Maps became meaningless. Navigation became artificial. Truth became forbidden. The world everyone accepts today may actually be the fake one. And then everything comes together. The log pose, the road poneglyphs, the red line, the calm belts, Nami's dream, Kid's devil fruit, Roger's smile, the void century, the abyss. They all point toward the exact same conclusion. The One Piece has never just been about finding an island. It's about understanding the world. Because maybe Laugh Tale isn't hidden at the end of the Grand Line. Maybe it's hidden behind the greatest navigation puzzle ever created. A puzzle that only someone who understands history, someone who understands magnetism, someone who understands maps, and someone who inherited Joy Boy's will can finally solve. And when that happens, Roger's final words won't just inspire another pirate era. They'll reveal what he was trying to tell us all along. The world has been upside down for 800 years, and Luffy is about to turn it back. But there is still one final piece of this puzzle, one sentence, spoken by another Pirate King level legend, that suddenly changes everything. Right before Whitebeard died, after confirming that the One Piece is real, he looked directly at Sengoku and said something incredibly specific. When somebody finds that treasure, the entire world will be turned upside down. Think about that. Whitebeard never says, the world government will fall. He never says, there will be a great war. He never even says, the seas will be free. Instead, he uses almost the exact same wording as Roger. The world will be turned upside down. Two men, both reached the greatest heights of piracy. Both understood Roger's dream. Both chose the exact same expression. That cannot be an accident. Now imagine this. Roger reaches Laugh Tale. He learns the true history. He discovers what happened during the Void Century. He realizes why the world no longer works naturally. He laughs. Years later, Whitebeard hears Roger's story. Not every detail, but enough to understand one thing. If someone finally reaches the end, the world itself will change. Not politically, physically. Because, be honest, One Piece has been preparing us for a world-changing event since the very beginning. The destruction of Fishman Island, Madame Charlie's prophecy, the promise Joy Boy made, Noah, Poseidon, the All Blue. None of these mysteries can happen independently. They all require one thing. The world itself has to change. Think about Sanji's dream. Finding the All Blue. How can one ocean contain fish from every single sea? Right now, it can't. The red line separates everything. The calm belts separate everything. The Grand Line divides everything. The world is literally split apart. But destroy the red line, and suddenly, every ocean becomes connected. Every species can migrate. Every current changes. The All Blue is born naturally. Now think about Laboon. Why did Oda spend so much time making us care about one lonely whale all the way back in Reverse Mountain? Because Laboon is waiting on the opposite side of the red line. Brook promised he would come back. But maybe Oda wasn't simply setting up an emotional reunion. Maybe he was quietly showing us something much bigger. One day, there won't be a red line anymore. The barrier separating the world will disappear. And if the red line disappears, what happens to Fishman Island? It sits directly beneath Marijois, exactly where the red line crosses the Grand Line. Destroy the red line, and Fishman Island can no longer exist below it. Suddenly, Joy Boy's apology, the Noah, Poseidon, everything begins fitting together. The Noah was never built for war. It was built to carry an entire civilization to the surface. And then, Nami's dream changes once again. Imagine the world after the final war. The red line is gone. The seas reconnect. Magnetic fields begin changing. Ocean currents completely transform. Every map ever drawn instantly becomes obsolete. Who becomes the first person capable of creating the map of this new world? Nami. Not because she wants fame, not because she wants treasure, because that has always been her dream, to draw the complete map of the true world. Roger's words become almost poetic. Let's turn the world upside down. Maybe Roger never meant let's flip the planet. Maybe he meant let's return it to the way it was always supposed to be. Now let's go back to one of the very first conversations in One Piece. Buggy and Shanks arguing over the 4 Pole and the South Pole. Back then, it looked like nothing. Today, it feels completely different. Because poles define navigation, poles define magnetism, poles define maps. And Oda chose to introduce that conversation on Roger's ship, not on a random pirate crew, on the only crew that already knew the truth. Then there's Lodestar. Even the name is suspicious. The word Lodestar literally refers to a guiding star, a point sailors have used for navigation for centuries. Again, everything keeps coming back to navigation. And maybe that's why Roger laughed. Imagine spending your entire life searching for the final island, only to discover the greatest mystery was never the island itself. It was the world. Maybe Laugh Tale isn't called Laugh Tale because the treasure is funny. Maybe Roger laughed because the answer was so unbelievably obvious once he finally saw it. The world had been lying to everyone without anyone even realizing it. Now let's return to Eustass Kid one last time. People often ask why Oda keeps bringing Kid back into the story despite his defeats. Because narratively, Kid still has unfinished business. His devil fruit isn't connected to fire, or darkness, or earthquakes. It's connected to magnetism. The one force the Grand Line has been built around since chapter 101. What if Oda has been saving Kid for one final purpose? To restore the world's magnetic balance. To break whatever ancient force has kept humanity following the same invisible paths for 800 years. And finally, let's talk about the Abyss. If another side of the world truly exists, if the Void Century still survives somewhere beyond our understanding, if Emu has been ruling from the shadows of another realm, then maybe Luffy's final journey isn't simply reaching Laugh Tale. Only one person could return the world to its original shape. And when Luffy finally reaches Laugh Tale, he won't just become the Pirate King. He'll do exactly what Roger asked. He'll finally turn the world upside down. But that's just my theory. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because if this theory turns out to be true, then the greatest treasure in One Piece was never waiting at the end of the Grand Line. It was waiting for someone to finally understand the world itself.